So, ahead of President Trump's Oval Office speech tonight, our own Major Garrett, chief Washington correspondent, spoke to the Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, met with Democratic leadership over the weekend as progress toward a border wall funding deal has stalled.
So here's some of Major's conversation with Mike Pence.
Vice President, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Major.
Will President Trump declare a national emergency tonight in his address to the nation?
When the President addresses the nation tonight, he'll be laying out the facts to the American people of what is a genuine humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border. Major, as we sit here today, nearly 60,000 people over the past several months have attempted to come into our country illegally. But for the first time, the predominant number are families and unaccompanied children, and it simply is overwhelming the ability of our Customs and Border Patrol to deal with it. Add to that human trafficking, the flow of narcotics, the apprehension in the last year of 17,000 individuals at our southern border with previous criminal histories, and the American people will hear from the President tonight that we have a crisis and we have to address it, and the time has come for the Democrats to come to the table and start negotiating, not just to end the partial government shutdown, but to address the humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border.
But as you understand all too well, Mr. Vice President, the idea of this national emergency and going around the appropriations process is something the President has suggested. The country is waiting to find out. Has he made a determination? Is he going to use tonight's bully pulpit to say that?
Well, the President was asked if it was something he was considering, and he said it's something that we're looking at.
That was a few days ago.
But the fact is,
the legal review done here at the White House?
The Congress should do its job and come to the table. We spent the entire weekend in this room with senior aides for the Republican and Democrat leadership on Capitol Hill. We listened carefully to what their priorities were. What the President put forward is a reaffirmation of his determination to build a wall on the southern border. But the President said it could be a steel barrier, recognizing the concern in concrete sun. I think that there were many Democrats in the leadership meetings who expressed concern about concrete, and the President said we'll build a steel barrier. But the President also listened carefully to their priorities about additional humanitarian and medical resources, additional technology for screening at all of our ports of entry. We've incorporated those reforms, including legal reforms. And the proposal that we have on the table is a reflection of the President's priority to build a wall, to provide resources to Customs, Border Patrol, and Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. But our proposal also incorporates what we're hearing from the Democrats. But the fact is, what we heard over the course of this weekend is they're not even willing to negotiate until the President reopens the government. And
why won't he do that?
The American people deserve better than that. They deserve the Democrats to come back to the table, start negotiating, and we believe we can resolve this through the legislative process.
Why do you have to put them together? Why can't the rest of the government, unaffected by DHS, Department of Homeland Security funding, be funded and then deal with this issue separately? Why must there be a partial government shutdown affecting all these agencies that have nothing to do with this underlying debate?
Well, really for two reasons. Number one is these are the bills that were remaining at the end of the year.
But you can separate them out. You did that when you were in the House. You know that.
Yeah, right. But the fact is, as we've also listened to Democrats, they're calling for changes in our ability to accept applications for asylum at our embassies in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. That would require a change in the State Department's appropriations bill. So what the President is saying is, let's resolve this issue with the crisis on the southern border. If there are other changes in other bills, let's make those changes. But the truth is, Major, you've been around Washington for a while. You know that we could resolve this in a matter of hours if the Democrats will come to the table and start negotiating in good faith. And the American people also deserve to know, on the very first day of this partial government shutdown, the President sent me to Capitol Hill to make a good faith offer that would have avoided the shutdown altogether. Now we're 3 weeks in, and tonight the American people, the President will take his case directly to the American people.
So Major Garrett joins us now from the White House. Major, just that snippet was so interesting. I really like the way you pressed the vice president on, some of the wording that the president has used about this being a national emergency. And as we know, the president often says stuff, but actually putting the mechanism in place, starting the machinery to get something done to truly make this a national emergency and circumvent Congress is a completely different thing. But he certainly likes to throw out stuff to make people nervous, and you really pushed the VP on that. What stood out the most to you from this conversation?
Well, that point, Anne-Marie, no answer on whether the president will declare a national emergency, even though he's created this expectation, borderline anxiety about trying to use this very unusual application of executive power. But then when the vice president said, after me pressing him 2 or 3 times, Congress needs to do its job, all right, that tells me the White House is not prepared to go down that road and still wants to work on the quote-unquote negotiating process. The other thing that struck me is the emphasis on the humanitarian crisis, not the terrorist crisis. This is clearly the administration changing its language, backpedaling away from some of the fear-mongering associated with what turned out to be unsubstantiated assertions about terrorist border crossings on the southern border. And there's more of our conversation where I pressed the vice president quite specifically on that. But this emphasis on humanitarian crisis, why does that matter? Well, because if you look across the polling data, yes, the Trump base is supportive, but many independent voters are not, of the partial government shutdown and this underlying debate about border security. And many nominally attached or suburban Republicans, they're often the same, are not comfortable with it either. So if you put it in a more non-terrorist, non-national security, but more humanitarian orientation, you're trying to appeal to those voters saying, well, we're really not talking about national security or terrorism. Think about all these humanitarian issues we're trying to address. These poor women and children, families that need our help. That is clearly a rhetorical shift in the last 3 or 4 days to try to change the impression of what this shutdown is about. And that struck me because the vice president repeatedly referred to the humanitarian crisis on the border, not the national security or / terrorist crisis at the border, even though that's where the White House was last week.
So, yeah. Major, that would appear to offer a conflicting message, right? If the president is going to declare a national emergency, that would indicate the first argument, which is that there's a security threat to the people of this country. If it's to say, well, there's a humanitarian threat, of course, I think both sides of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, get behind addressing a humanitarian threat without declaring a national emergency. As you say, many experts, many immigration experts, security experts have said that the president is, in some cases, providing the American people with outright falsehoods or exaggerating the matter at the border. The question I have for you, and I know there's more of your interview with the vice president later on, did he indicate that the president has asked the White House counsel to look into the legality of declaring a national emergency and circumventing the Congress?
Well, you saw where I said, is the legal review at the White House done? And all the vice president would say is Congress should do its job. All right, meaning the negotiating process and resolving this through legislative mechanisms is the preferred path. I was hoping there would at least be an answer, an affirmative answer, one way or the other. Yes or no, has the White House counsel's office, because clearly it's being studied here at the White House. That's a fact. Whether it's done and whether it's ready and whether the president believes he can do this, unclear. And I gave the vice president ample opportunity to tell Trump supporters who want him to use every mechanism in his legal authority to try to secure the border, to tell them, hey, we've got it and we may use it. The vice president did not go down that road, though I gave him every opportunity to do so. That tells me either they're holding it back, they're not quite ready, or it's not quite done.
So can we talk just briefly about the Oval Office announcement that's going to be coming today? What do you think? Who do you think the president is going to be talking to when he speaks tonight? Is it going to be to Democrats? Is it going to be to maybe people who are on the fence? I was almost going to say on the border, who are on the fence about this issue, or is he simply, like we hear over and over again, him sort of preaching to the choir, preaching to his own supporters who already agree with him, like he says, who are already willing to give up their paycheck for border security?
Well, the president, as the vice president said, because I asked him directly that, who's the audience tonight? Is it wavering Republicans or entrenched Democrats? And the vice president said, well, it's everybody. Well, The White House knows, and the Vice President knows from personal experience, that Republicans in the House and Senate are beginning to crack a little bit in their unity on this whole question. And Democrats in the House are going to put bills on the floor this week to reopen certain parts of the government. And some Republicans, 7 already last week, voted for one. There may be 15 or 20, maybe more, voting for some of these Democratic-sponsored pieces of legislation. The White House wants to keep those defections to an absolute minimum. That's one of the reasons for an Oval Office address, to basically tell your party the president is going as far as he can. There is no other higher rhetorical level the president can reach than requesting network time for an Oval Office address. That's it. And the president and this White House are using that tool in this construct of wavering Republicans and entrenched, unified Democrats to try to hold his Republicans together and, if possible, persuade people who are trying to get a sense of what this debate is all about, what the president's priorities are. And I'm sure, based on the vice president's rhetoric, one aspect of tonight's address will be, look at my reasonableness on this. I'm just trying to get a certain amount of money. It's not very large in the grand scheme of the federal budget to address a need that I promised during the campaign. I only want good faith negotiations from the Democrats. We can resolve this. And that core argument about a legitimate issue, a small amount of money compared to the larger federal budget, and my overall reasonableness will be part of what the president tries to tell the American people tonight to move the polling numbers in his direction. If that doesn't happen, congressional Republicans will say, Mr. President, you use the biggest platform you can create, and still things haven't changed, and then political calculations will begin to shift.
All right, Major, always a pleasure talking to you.